Hi everyone, it's Abby with the Bead Place and beadplace.net. And in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to make a fun and trendy 3-strand seed bead bracelet. We're going to be using a fun juxtaposition of colors today. We have beautiful matte seed beads in 3 different colors around the outside of the bracelet. And then in the center of the bracelet, we're using a band of metallic silver seed beads. So all the materials we're using today can be found at www.beadplace.net. We have kits for the materials for this project in lots of beautiful colorways, and you can also find all of the tools we're using linked down below. We're going to be using just a few tools today. I have a magical crimper. This is a really cool tool that turns our 2x2 crimp tubes into a ball that looks like a bead. So this is the universal magic crimper size. This works best with our medium soft flex wire, which is going to be anywhere from a 0.018 diameter to 0.019. So if your wire is that size, that will work. And it works best with our 2x2 crimp tubes. You want to make sure they're solid tubes and not seamed tubes. We have a flex wire cutter. I like using a cutter for flex wire or jeweler's wire that is specifically designed to cut through that steel cable. If you're using your flush cutter that is designed to cut your wire, you're going to eventually dull those blades. So use your specific tools for their specific purposes and you will be much happier in the long run. Now I also have a couple of bead stoppers here. I've got one for seed beads and one for just regular all-purpose. You can use whatever size you want. I'm just showing you the size options here. So we'll be using a couple of them as we work our project. The materials we're using today are 30 inches of medium soft flex wire. We also have 6 2x2 sterling crimp tubes. We have a 3-strand snap clasp. These snap clasps are my favorite type of clasp for dainty, lightweight bracelets. They work just like this. So they work like a snap, kind of like a ball and socket. They're also referred to as ball and socket clasps. So the beads that we're going to be using today are size 11 Delica beads. Now these beads are cylinders rather than the classic rocaille shape. So that's what my math and figures are sized for. That's what we're using in the kit. So we've got 3 colors here of a beautiful matte finish. Now these have 120 beads each in the bags. And so 120 beads each gives us 3 8-inch strands. So we're also accounting for the clasp, the crimps, and the other beads that we're adding in the middle, but there's approximately 20 beads per inch. So the star of the show is these silver galvanized seed beads. There's 60 of these in the kit, so that divided by the 3 strands gives us 20 beads per strand. So let's talk math now. All right, so let's talk equations. So we're going to be figuring our bracelet size against our wrist size. So what you're going to want to do is measure your wrist tight. That's your wrist size. We're going to add a 1/2 inch to that, and that's going to give us our bracelet size. So that's average for comfort, and that's what I find comfortable for this bracelet. So let's say my wrist measures 6 inches. My bracelet size should be 6.5 inches. So these figures here are for your bracelet size. So a 6-inch bracelet would be for someone who has a 5.5-inch wrist. So these are my equations for the number of beads that you'll use according to your wrist or according to your bracelet size. So for a 6-inch bracelet, you'll want to use 40 side beads on each side. So times 2, obviously that's 80. So I am going to make you guys do a little bit of math here. For a 6.5-inch finished bracelet, you're going to use 45 side beads. And by side beads, I mean those beautiful matte, colorful delicas. So 45 side beads times 2. So obviously, what is it? 90. Good job. So we're going to do a 7-inch bracelet. That's going to be 50 beads on each side of those colorful delica side beads. So times 2, class, that's 100. So for a 7.5-inch bracelet, 55 side beads times 2, it's 110. And then for an 8-inch bracelet, we're going to be using 60 beads on each side times 2 is 120. So again, we're going to be using 20 of those bright, beautiful silver delicas in the center of each of these strands. So if you need to, take a screenshot of this, pause the video, and make a note so that you're able to easily refer back to it whenever you decide to make this bracelet at home. Before we get started, we'll just need to do a few things to prepare for our project. So I have cut our 30 inches of jeweler's wire into 3 10-inch pieces. I have also laid out my seed beads in a way that'll make it easy for me to start my project. So I'm going to be making a 7.5-inch bracelet today. So I have 55 of one color in a pile. I have 20 of my silver center accent beads, and then I have 55 more of that same color in another pile on the other side of the silver beads. I've also done that to the other colors of the seed beads. So the first thing that I'm going to do to actually get started stringing is I'm going to put a bead stopper onto my wire. In order to open the bead stopper, what we need to do is squeeze the ears of the bead stopper, and that opens the spring. This bead stopper just allows us to stop the beads from falling off while we're working with it. And what's great about bead stoppers is that they have multiple openings, so they're perfect for multi-strand projects. I'm going to move the other wires out of the way so that I can get started and have a little bit more room. Now, the first thing that we're going to string before we start to string the seed beads is a crimp bead. So these are 2x2 crimp tubes. They're sterling silver and they're not seamed. They're solid crimp tubes. That's what's going to work the best for this project and what works best for the durability of any jewelry project. It also is the only crimp bead that will work with the magic crimper, and that's what makes this project look so pretty. So after we've strung our crimp tube onto our wire, we're going to start stringing our seed beads. So again, I have 55 of one color. I have the 20 of the beautiful silver accent beads, and then I have 55 over here. So I'm making a 7.5-inch bracelet, and those are the numbers that will work for this size that I'm making. But again, refer back to the math that we did before in order to adjust for your bracelet size. So I'm gonna start stringing. I like to work with the soft flex wire just like it's a needle. Now these matte beads are gonna have a little bit more grab. The matte finish makes them a little bit stickier, but I like to work on a bead mat like this and just kind of spread my beads apart, and these bead mats really make it a lot easier to string the beads. You can just kind of poke into it and they'll hop right on. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you have a clean cut on the end of your wire, and that's also going to make your life a lot easier. So if you have cut it a little bit crooked, or if you've got a little burr on the end of your wire from cutting with a bad spot of your cutters or the wrong cutter, you want to make sure to go in and get a clean cut, and that clean cut is going to ensure that these beads won't run away from you. So I'm going to be stringing these beads for a little while, and I'll come back to show you what I've done. So I've just finished stringing the first 55 seed beads, and I'm going to now go in and string the 20 silver beads. Now, because these are a little bit smoother, have a texture, you might notice that they go on the wire a little bit easier. Or you might not notice. I don't know. But I just think it's kind of interesting how the different textures of the beads make it behave a little bit more differently on the wire. You'll also notice, oh, come back here. You'll also notice there's a little bit less flexibility when you're using matte beads versus smooth beads, especially when you're using gemstone beads. Any of the matte finishes will kind of not have as flexible as a drape. And that goes the same for seed beads like these. So I have strung my one side, my center section, and now I'm going to string 55 more seed beads on the other side. So you can watch me start, and then we'll do some movie magic, and then you'll see it done. All right, so you can see that I have strung 55, 20, and another 55 beads, and all that's left to do to this strand is to put another crimp bead on it. So it starts and ends with a crimp bead. Now I'm going to hook my bead stopper onto the end of that wire, and we can set it aside and start on the next one. So if you just have one bead stopper, what you could do is just start in that same bead stopper that we've been using. However, just for clarity and so you guys can see it a little bit easier, I'm going to use another bead stopper to start stringing my next set of beads. So I'm going to string my crimp bead on, and then I'm going to do the same thing with my next color set. So as you can see, I went ahead and strung the next set of beads as well, but you want to make sure to double check all of your counts. Make sure that the center section of silver beads has 20 beads in it, and then double check all of your seed bead sides to make sure they have your specific number of seed beads that you're going for. So I've actually triple checked now to make sure I've got 55 beads on this side, 55 beads on this side, and then 20 beads in the middle. It is so important for this project to make sure that your counts are correct and everything lines up perfectly, because that's what gives us that really cool juxtaposition look. All right, let's get to crimping. So I'm going to start by removing one side of my wire from the bead stopper. I'm going to be working with one color at a time. I have my clasp here, and I'm going to leave my clasp clasped together for this until we get to the other side. So I'm going to put the first strand that I want to put on my bracelet through the top hole of one side of my snap clasp. So I'm going to string that on right next to the crimp bead, and then I'm going to take the wire and bring it back through just the crimp bead. So you can see that I've looped my clasp onto my bracelet at this point. So now what we're going to do is tighten that loop just by pulling the bracelet, and this loop here gets a lot smaller. We want it to be as small as we can get it to go with just enough room for us to crimp. So I'm going to be using the magical crimp tool. If you look on the inside of the tool, you can see that there's a balled out section. It looks like there's like a scoop missing from it. So that's where we're going to place our crimp bead. It has to be lined up exactly in the center of that little scoop, and that's what's going to help us form it into a ball. So it's important to keep our tension uniform when we're crimping so that all the strands will line up to be exactly the same length. So I've placed my crimp right in the center of my crimp tool. I'm going to double check to make sure. I'm going to look from both sides to make sure it's centered, and I'm going to adjust the tension one more time. I'm also going to make sure that my clasp isn't caught inside the tool so that when I squeeze it, I'm not going to squeeze the clasp and damage it in any way. So I'm going to squeeze. When I open it, it should look like ravioli. So you can see how it kind of looks like a puffed pillow, that the corners are kind of pinched together. Now what I'm going to do is turn my crimp sideways, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to line it exactly in the center of my crimping tool, make sure my clasp is out of the way, and I'm going to squeeze down again. So it's starting to look like a little bit more of a rounded tube at this point. So it's still a little bit cylindrical, but we're starting to get there. So now I'm going to, again, move my clasp out of the way. I'm going to go in and squeeze from a different angle. Now you'll kind of be able to feel the crimp squeeze. I'm just going to open slightly, rotate and squeeze, open slightly, rotate and squeeze. The way I learned to crimp with the magical crimper was to imagine yourself squeezing at all the numbers of a clock. You don't have to be that precise about it, but just make sure that there's no resistance at any angle that you're squeezing. So it should be perfectly round when we're done with it. So you can see now that it looks like a nice round smooth ball. Now normally what I would do is I'd tuck this tail end into a bead that would have a large enough hole to hide the knot, or I'd kind of alter my design so that I could put a bead at the end to tuck the tail end into. However, we want this to stay pretty dainty. So I'm going to be doing something here that I rarely do, and that is trimming the tail end of our jewelry. Whoa, trimming the tail end of our jewelry project flush to the crimp. Usually we don't like to do that because we don't want any of those ends to snag or scratch, and it sometimes can look a little bit unsightly. But as long as you get it trimmed very close to the crimp, you don't really see it too much. And then we can go in with that crimping pliers one more time just to make sure that the tail end sits flat. So now what we're going to do is slide all of the beads down to the end that we just crimped. We're going to take the bead stopper off of the other end, and we're going to complete the circle. So what I'm going to do is hold this so that it would look like it's on or a completed closed bracelet. That way I'm able to tell where my strand needs to go on this side. That way I'm not going to crimp all the way up here. I want to make sure that I'm matching where my crimp is going to go on the other side. So I'm going to string my wire through the bottom hole, just like how I am on the other side. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring my wire back through the crimp bead. And then, whoa, and then I am going to pull it tight. So this time I'm pulling the tail end rather than the bracelet wire. And that's going to transition the slack from out of the bracelet into the tail end. So we're going to close up that loop. And now before we crimp it, what we're going to do is open the clasp, and we're going to make sure we've got all of the slack out of the bracelet. So I just like to run my fingers down it to make sure that the beads aren't caught anywhere. And then I'm going to pull the crimp down just a little bit using my fingers. And I'm going to pull the tail end out. So now I'm going to go in and crimp the same way. This time we want to make sure that we're not going to pop any of these seed beads. So just make sure those seed beads aren't in the way when we're crimping. So we're going to squeeze, open it, see how it looks like ravioli with those pinched edges. We're going to rotate it and work all the way around in a circle. So I'm going to crimp and then trim the tail end, and I'll come back to show you what I've done. Next, I'll be adding the next color. You can order them however you'd like, but this is just my choice. So I've removed the bead stopper from one side of my wire, and then I'm going to bring the wire through the middle opening of my clasp. I'm going to bring the wire back through my crimp just like we did before. So this time we're going to pull the slack into the bracelet. And the reason why we do that is so that we have a lot of extra room to work on the other side. Now, when we crimp this side, it's going to be a little bit more awkward because we have that other strand in the way. And also, the hole is in the middle and not on the end, so it's less accessible. So what I like to do is bring that other finished strand up and out of the way. That way I have as much clearance in here as I can get. Now remember to match the tensions. So whatever size loop you left here at the beginning, we're going to match with this one here. So I'm going to crimp this just the way that I did before, making sure that it's in the center. And then again, make sure that your clasp isn't inside the crimping tool when we go to crimp. So I'm going to crimp this, trim the end, and then come back to show you the other side. So next I'm going to take the bead stopper off the other end and bring my wire through the middle hole of the other side of the clasp. So at this point, I just like to make sure everything is correct. Make sure that your bead strand lengths are the same. Make sure you've got 20 on each of the center sections. And then we're going to want to try to match the tension as best as possible. So bring the wire back through the crimp to make that loop. We're going to pull that tension tight. Remember, we're going to run our fingers down those beads to make sure there's nothing caught anywhere. We're going to pull the crimp down and then hold on to that crimp and pull the tail end out. So here is where we're going to make sure we've got the correct tension. We're going to hold this strand straight. And notice how this strand is hanging significantly lower. That's because this loop here is a lot wider. So I need to go in and tighten that loop, and then that's going to bring them to the same size. So I'll just double check everything. Yep, same size. So now what I'm going to do is go in and crimp. So you guys have seen me do that before. No need to watch me now. I'm going to do the other strand and come back to you. So I've crimped all 3 strands on the one side of my clasp, but I'm going to go in and crimp the last crimp bead. So I'm taking my bead stopper off, putting my wire through the last empty hole of the other side of my clasp, and I'm going to bring the wire back through the crimp. So here is where we set the the size and the tension for the whole bracelet, really. So even if you've made a little bit of a tension error within the first 2 strands, here's where we can really set the size and angle of the way everything comes together. So what we're going to do is just really make sure that all of those strands lay appropriately. So you can see that my middle strand sits just a little bit wider than my first strand. So what I'm going to do in order to compensate for that is I'm going to leave my bottom strand a little bit wider as well. I'm not going to pull it super tight to match my first strand, because then what would happen when we wear our bracelet is that middle strand is going to really stick out when we're wearing it. So instead, what we want to do is kind of match the tension variance in that last strand so that that last strand sits a little bit bigger, and that can be our bottom strand, and it's going to have this natural kind of graduation in size so that it looks nice when we wear it. So if that just was a little bit too much to handle, don't worry about it. This is just extra engineering, just tips and tricks for troubleshooting. Just crimp, be happy with your tension, and you'll make a beautiful bracelet. So I'm going to adjust the tension to exactly where I want it to be, just by kind of pushing the crimp down and pulling the tail end, or kind of sliding the crimp up. You can push it down. However you want to do it, just make sure you're not letting this tail end go too much. I'm going to check my tension. Oh, I'm going to make that just a little bit tighter. I kind of made it a little bit too loose. So I'm going to pull that a little bit tighter, check my tension one more time. Okay, now it's perfect. Now I'm going to go in and crimp, and we'll show you the finished result. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to give us a big thumbs up. It really helps our channel out. If you have any questions, or if you'd just like to say hi, drop them in the comments below. I do my best to respond to all of the comments that anyone might leave below. If you want to see more projects like this, please subscribe to our channel. We put out new, trendy, and creative DIY jewelry projects all the time. If you want to support our channel even further, please remember to check out the Patreon link down below. It's just a fun way to support our channel with a monthly subscription. You can join our private Patreon Facebook group where we do quarterly giveaways for project kits, and you get sneak peeks of upcoming tutorials and all kinds of fun stuff. So thank you so much for watching.